Hey friends, SGT here, and I couldn't be more pleased to have Harley Schlanger, the national spokesperson for the LaRouche organization, back on the line for us. Harley, welcome back. We have a lot to talk about. We were scheduled to speak on Friday morning, and we had to reschedule. What a lucky turn of events, because over the weekend, I guess on Friday afternoon, the oligarchs, including Angela Merkel and the IMF and the European Central Bank, decided that they wanted to go in and steal from the people of Cyprus, just like gun-toting thieves, and give that money, hand that money over to the banksters. And it's really, really outrageous.
It's more than outrageous, because the first question you have to ask yourself is, Cyprus is a tiny island. Why are they going to such lengths when Mario Draghi of the European Central Bank and Juncker of the European Union are saying that the euro crisis is over? I mean, Cyprus has somewhere around a 10 billion euro outstanding obligation. And you would think they could extend it, bail it out, but they've run out of bailout room. And so they made a decision. This was the IMF, which admits that it's incompetent when it comes to these things, the European Union, and with a gun to their head, the government of Cyprus agreed to tax the citizens of Cyprus, tax their savings accounts. It is thievery. President Putin of Russia, when he was briefed on this today, said this is unjust and inexplicable.
Dangerous, in fact. He called it dangerous, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And partly, who's getting bailed out here? It's the German banks, it's the British banks. And so here you have this tiny island, which, if it's not bailed out, threatens the survival of the whole Eurozone. Now, this is in the same context as the continuing collapse of Greece, and now we're seeing the collapse of Italy. And I had the opportunity to visit Italy about a week and a half ago after the elections. The elections in Italy sort of give you an indication of where things are going in Europe. It was a collective rejection of austerity, of technocrats, but they had no solution. And so you have a comedian getting a lot of votes, 25%. You had one of the main parties get 28%. Berlusconi, who's a totally discredited degenerate, got 28%. But Mario Monti, who was imposed by the European Union to carry out the austerity on Italy, he only got 10% of the vote. So you're having a wave of rejection, 1 million people out in the streets in Portugal a week ago last Sunday. So it is a propitious moment, but you've got to have some answers.
Yeah. Now, when you mentioned the Italian comedian, are you referring to Beppe Grillo?
Yes.
Yeah.
Beppe Grillo, yeah.
Yeah. What an interesting fellow. People can Google his YouTube videos. I mean, he's literally filled arenas with tens of thousands of people and spoken harsh truth about banksters for a very, very long time, and about this debt-based paradigm, which is literally a paradigm designed to enslave, Harley. And I know you know that. And people are waking up. The question is, what can they do? Because as you refer to this thing happening in Cyprus as a tax, which is, of course, the official spin, only an evil authoritarian government could pull something off like a bank robbery and call it a tax. It's absolutely absurd. And if people stand for it, then God help us.
Well, the people are pulling their money out of the banks. They were going to. In order to do this, they had to declare a bank holiday. The EU offered to send policemen to protect the banks, naturally, to protect the banks. It is nothing but blatant thievery. Now, the problem, to go back to Grillo for a second, because it's actually very interesting, he's an example of a negative figure in the sense that he's against the political class, he's against the austerity, but then he said he's actually not against the austerity, he's against the way it's being done. And he also said he's not against the euro. Now, he becomes kind of an outlet, a safety valve for people to blow off steam. What it looks like they're going to try and do in Italy is put in another technocratic government. Now, I think this is important because what's been done in Greece and Italy and Cyprus that's not working in any of these countries is what Barack Obama is calling the grand bargain. And he's going to the Republicans and he's saying, you give me extra tax money and I'll go ahead with the austerity. And he's got the Republicans angry at him because they're not going to go along with the taxes, but he's getting a lot of Democrats angry at him. But again, the question, Sean, that we keep coming back to is, where is the alternative to this? And what's interesting, when I was in Italy, I was invited to visit the Republic of San Marino, and this is an interesting place. Your listeners might find it very fascinating. You can go Google it and read about it. It's the oldest standing republic in the world. And they rejected monarchy back during the 14th century when Italy was run by all these local dukes and principalities. They've never accepted any other government than a republic. Until recently, it was debt-free. In fact, it's still debt-free, but the International Monetary Fund was in a couple days before I was, telling them they have to start cutting their spending. And they said, why? We're debt-free. And they said, well, you're not going to be debt-free for long. And they were wondering, well, what is the IMF planning to do to them? While I was there, I got to address a group of parliamentarians, the former finance minister and others. They introduced a Glass-Steagall bill in the Republic of San Marino. So it's the first country in Europe, and San Marino is not in the European Union, but they're in the Council of Europe, the first government to introduce Glass-Steagall as a bill to be debated. It's going to be debated in the next couple of weeks. And the reason they're doing that is they're looking at Italy, where you're seeing the corruption and fraud of the Monte dei Paschi Bank. They're looking at the United States, where you saw the hearings last Friday with J.P. Morgan, I presume.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, the derivatives fraud and the London whale and all the crimes of J.P. Morgan and the big banks are laid out in plain sight for everyone to see.
But then what do? Levin says, well, this looks like criminal activity, but when we just a week earlier, Holder said we don't prosecute these banks. We can't prosecute them because the system is too weak. So even while they're talking about the strength of the U.S. economy and the strength of the Eurozone, they're paranoid for good reason that the whole thing can implode at any moment. And that's what we're seeing with the Cyprus situation. That's what we're seeing with Holder's too big to fail memo. And now you're seeing a little bit of a counter gang, which I think is a not good thing, which is the focus of Richard Fisher from the Dallas Federal Reserve and others on the size of banks. Yes, the size is a problem, but it's the function. It's the fact that they speculate. And what good would it do to allow them to speculate in smaller banks? I think what we really have to do is have a situation where we regulate against precisely what J.P. Morgan has been doing. And, of course, the Dodd-Frank bill didn't do that. The Dodd-Frank bill, even though the bankers said they opposed it, they love it because it's not even written yet. There are no specific regulations in it.
Let's circle back to Cyprus real quickly, though, because why, when the system is absolutely on the edge, which Jim Willey and you and Andy Hoffman and so many other great pundits have told us, Jim Sinclair, why would they do this for $10 billion? $10 billion in today's world is an absolute joke. Is this not just a litmus test to see what they can get away with?
Well, Sean, take a look at how little coverage there is in the media of Iceland. You know, Iceland basically said, screw you to the European Union. We're not paying these debts. Because what happened in Iceland was that the British banks came in, used the Icelandic currency for a carry trade, borrowed money against the Icelandic banks, caused the Icelandic banks to have to borrow huge amounts from Britain to back up their carry trade. And at a certain point, the government of Iceland, the people of Iceland said, we're not paying. Now, not only have they survived, but they're thriving. But when do we hear about this? I think what they're afraid of is that Cyprus, which is in the Eurozone, Iceland is not, but Cyprus, which is in the Eurozone, if they were to renege on the $10 billion, even though that seems small, what they're really worried about is the $2.7 trillion owed by Italy. They're worried about the over $2 trillion owed by Spain. And this goes right back to Angela Merkel and the problem in Germany, because the German banks are overexposed. Since we talked last time, I remember on the last program I brought up the problem with the French banks. This is now out in the public, in the European press, that the French banks are in terrible shape. And, of course, also since we talked last time, Britain is now supposedly in a triple-dip recession. So they're very frightened that a lightning or a single spark could ignite the whole system. And so that's why they're going out of their way to do something so blatantly illegal and criminal against the people of Cyprus. And you can be sure, in fact, I know this for a case, this is being discussed extensively in Italy today. Well, what would this mean for Italy? And, the Italians have already seen their savings erode, their economy collapse. The debt is continuing to grow. Their spread is back up toward the 6% level, which makes it impossible for the government to fund its operations. So default is once again on the lips of people when it comes to the Italian situation. So you're right. Cyprus is a litmus test, or rather a potential example of a breakaway from the euro, and they will not allow that.
Now, we talk a lot about protecting oneself and one's finances with physical precious metals. We don't have to get into that, Harley. I know that you support the idea of real money. And what I'm driving at, Harley, is that if they can steal 10% of your savings account, of your fiat money out of your savings account overnight, or in the case of Venezuela, if they can devalue the currency by 40% overnight, there is no safe harbor. They're going to give us no respite from their crimes, are they?
Well, this is the point that Lyndon LaRouche has been making for a long time, which is that if you end up with the idea that there's a personal survival, that's ultimately your goal, what you're going to find is that you're going to be using your ammunition to protect what you have from other people who have been driven to desperation. The social chaos factor is something that most Americans don't think about, because we've been pretty lucky in our history. We had a pretty bloody civil war, but for the most part, we've had, at times, physical production that has given us surpluses, given us an idea that we can dig our way out of problems when they're here. Now, the problem today is that the only solution is to get the gangsters. We've got to shut down the criminal activities of groups like the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, the Federal Reserve. I mean, what they're doing with quantitative easing is also criminal. And what they're doing with building up their own balances of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, this is criminal behavior that that will destroy whatever savings people do have. In a sense, it's a different form of theft than just coming in and taking it out of your savings account, but it's the same thing. As you point out, devaluation has the same effect. The only solution is to beat the criminals. And in our country, we have something that most European countries do not have, which is a constitution which does place the power in the hands of the people. And it's really interesting to me right now that with the Congress beginning to show a little bit of fight against Obama, whether it's on the drone issue, whether it's on too big to fail, Holder, there's a little bit of fight coming out. I think Rand Paul did a great service to this country with his filibuster, not because it was I thought it was limited what he did, but what he did say is, Mr. President, there are constitutional limits to what you can do. And so we see that, but now it requires an additional level of the American people getting involved. And you look at the J.P. Morgan hearing, you look at these things. Oh, I know what I was going to say. There are judges who are rejecting the deals that are being made by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Justice Department with the criminal banks. There's a judge, a federal judge, who may reject the deal with Hong Kong Shanghai to pay a small fine to get out from under the drug money laundering charges. There's a judge in New York, a guy named Rakoff, who's rejected a deal that was made, I think it was with the SEC, made a deal with Citibank, and he rejected it. And Citibank and the SEC both appealed his ruling, and I'm pretty sure the appeals court is going to uphold him. So we're seeing some of this in the checks and balances of the court system. But ultimately, the people have to burn the tails of the Congress to get some significant legislation through. And the most important, and I keep stressing this, Mr. LaRouche stresses it all the time, is if you start with Glass-Steagall, what you do is you cancel the bailout. It's not just a regulatory policy. It says we're not going to any longer recognize the fiat money debts built up by these criminals as a government obligation.
Well, Harley, let me just interrupt though, as it pertains to Glass-Steagall, because I'm for it. I know that LaRouche has been pushing for it. You guys have been trying to move heaven and earth to get Glass-Steagall re-implemented, but hasn't that ship sailed? I mean, isn't the system too far gone and too criminal and too lacking in honor and too lacking in rule of law for Glass-Steagall to give us any shelter? I mean, the criminals run the show.
Well, if you start by declaring them bankrupt, which is what Glass-Steagall would do, it would essentially say no more bailouts. You have to deal with this overhang of trillions of dollars of derivatives on your own. Now, J.P. Morgan Chase, with the fraud they pulled on the London whale, could do it because the Fed was still shoveling money at them at 0% interest. If you take that cushion away, if you say no more bailouts, no more 0% interest money to enable you to carry bad debt that's marked at face value, which was never going to be redeemable, never could be paid, then you're bankrupting them. Now, that's the power that we have with our Constitution. We can put them through an orderly bankruptcy, or we're going to have a disorderly, chaotic resettling. And I think that's the benefit of Glass-Steagall.
Okay. Now let's circle back in the 5 or 6 minutes we have left. I think it's important to circle back and talk about Rand Paul's drone filibuster. I guess it wasn't really a filibuster about drones, but it gave him the opportunity to discuss the unconstitutional use of drones for the killing of American citizens. Harley, what do you think is the historical significance of that 13-hour filibuster that Rand Paul chose to engage in?
I think he overturned the apple cart because he basically said what a lot of people were thinking, which is that we have an imperial presidency which is out of control. And he said, by God, I'm going to stand up and do something about it. I'm going to show you that our system allows us to stand up in the face of power and expose the lies and the hypocrisy of what those in power are doing. And that's what Rand Paul did. And it's interesting that you had Ron Wyden, a liberal Democrat, backing him up. You had, as soon as this was done, 8 of the most liberal so-called progressives in the House came out with a very strong statement condemning Obama. So he opened the door. He basically said, as long as we have a Constitution, we as a Congress have a responsibility to stand up and say there's a limit to your power. And that's why it was so important that someone do it. And I commend Senator Paul for doing it. I think this is the kind of thing that can initiate a sea change or a paradigm shift in the Congress.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was very, very courageous, and now, it's all on the record, and I just think that all of us who care about liberty, who care about the rule of law, who care about turning this country back towards truth and honor and justice need to appreciate Rand Paul for what he did, because it took a heck of a lot of courage. And I personally get a little tired of the naysayers who say, oh, A, it was a waste of time, or B, he, like his father, is a Freemason, or any of the nonsense that people like to use to detract from his courage. And I think it's all a little pathetic, because what he did, no one else would have done.
Well, those are people who say those things who aren't doing a damn thing to defend their own freedom. And they don't realize that they're ultimately, in the long run, going to owe a debt to Rand Paul for doing that. And look, the other thing he did by doing that is he exposed the hypocrisy of people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham on the Republican side.
Yeah, Lieberman and the rest of them on the left. They're just pathetic traitors, in my opinion.
So what he did is something that will stand the test of time, as what John Kennedy wrote about in his book, Profiles in Courage, someone who had no official backing, who was being ridiculed by the mainstream media. And then, ironically, afterwards, I'll give you an example. Jane Harman, the former California congresswoman, former chair of the House Intelligence Committee, a real left liberal, she came out the other day. She's now, I think, at Brookings or Woodrow Wilson Center. She came out and said Rand Paul was right. And so we're seeing a shift now. And what I think is exciting about this is if you think about the Ron Paul supporters, the Tea Party supporters, and the Occupy Wall Street, some of the left progressives beginning to realize that they have a common enemy. And that common enemy has chosen Barack Obama as the instrument to push through fascism in the United States, a policy with the health care bill that's killing people already, a policy on the financial system that defends the biggest banks and destroys what's left of the physical economy, and his proclamation that he has the right to kill Americans. I think we're beginning to see a significant potential shift. And, it's not all because Rand Paul did it, but had he not done that, a lot of this wouldn't be clear, and he created a potential for clarity of potential allies to fight against this imperial presidency.
Well, an imperial presidency it is, and it seems to be an imperial world government. I did a piece recently called Cyprus Americana, in which I basically lay out the case that the oligarchs that run this planet and the oligarchs that are in charge of this country are malevolent. Okay, they are not benevolent like the family from the hit show Downton Abbey, which are an aristocratic, very, very uber wealthy family. In the same vein as the Rothschilds, or in this country the Rockefellers. And in that show, they paint this aristocratic family as being benevolent, as being kind, as having respect for the servant class, as caring for others, as caring for humanity. The problem is the people that run this world, the people in control of the Eurozone, the people in control of our government, Feinstein, McCain, Lieberman, Obama, these are not good people. These are not people that care about the servant class. These are the people that will go into accounts in Cyprus and steal from the servant class. And I'm just so glad to have you on, Harley, so that you can help us put a finer point on all this stuff, because it gets a little hard to keep track of.
Ironically, Sean, just to add to that, these are people who themselves are servants, because McCain and Obama are not exactly the oligarchs and aristocrats. They are puppets of those aristocrats.
That's true.
And this oligarchy, you're absolutely right, it's not just malevolent. Their view is that there are too many people and too many undeserving people. And this is where we see this kind of aristocracy merge with a fascist world order. And that's what has to be broken. And they're weak right now. The biggest problem our side has is that we see their power, but we don't see their weakness. And their weakness is they can only sustain this bubble as long as we stupidly go along and watch the stock market and say, well, maybe I can make a few bucks before it all blows out.
Well said. Well said. The chains rest upon us because we allow them to, and I, for one, am just sick and tired of it. I know everyone listening is. So let's all just continue to do our part to, stand up, speak out, and support those that are doing good things. Support Rand Paul. My God, everybody wants to say, where's the leadership? Who will stand up for our rights? If not me, who? Well, Rand Paul is just, Rand Paul set a great example for anybody who cares about this country, and I think it was a wake-up call for anyone paying attention, and the only people maligning him really was the Mockingbird media, who said that it was just a big waste of time. And that's because they're a bunch of liars. They're mockingbirds.
And people like McCain and Lindsey Graham and the real Obama supporters. But I think, as you're pointing out, there's more resistance out there than most people realize. Let's not make it personal resistance. It's got to be directed at change in Washington. And I think that's the lesson that Rand Paul showed us, that you can speak the truth to power and survive. And that's what we have to do.
Well, Harley, for me, you've become my new Bob Chapman. I had the great pleasure of being able to speak with Bob Chapman twice a month for a very long time. And boy, was he, a really kind-hearted man and somebody who really cared about others. And I just appreciate being able to talk to you now regularly. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
We miss Bob Chapman. I think I told you he and my wife spoke together for a number of years before he left the country. And he very often would cite the Executive Intelligence Review.
Yeah, with the International Forecaster. That's right.
Yeah.
No, he was always very, very kind to me, and people said very hurtful things about him, but he had a lot more people that loved him than didn't, and I miss him.
As I say, we miss him.
I miss him.
He was one of those few good people out there.
Well, Harley, thanks again for your time, and everybody, let's stick together and let's support Harley and his work over at LaRouchePAC.com. You guys can visit LaRouchePAC.com to get all the latest information coming out of that great organization. Harley, once again, thanks for everything you do. Thanks for your time.
It's my pleasure, Sean, and I'll talk to you again soon.
All right. See you later, Harley.